The cold of the observatory stone seeped through the velvet of her gown, a familiar chill that had become a second skin over 5 fallow years. 5 years. Ilara traced the number in the condensation her breath left on the great dome's glass. Outside, a gash of violet nebula bled across a sky choked with stars, a sight so impossibly beautiful it was cruel. The heavens were fertile, birthing new light in silent, magnificent explosions, while she remained an empty, sealed vessel. Her heart, a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her ribs, beat a rhythm of failure against her bones. It was the only sound in the high tower, a frantic, fleshy drum in the cathedral silence of the Blood King's fortress. She had been brought here as a bride of peace, a warm-blooded treaty to quell a century of war. Her duty was singular, etched into her marriage contract with ink and blood, to provide the ancient line of Volkov with an heir. A child of 2 worlds, of sun-warmed life and moon-chilled eternity, to bridge the chasm between their peoples. And she had failed. Each month, the hope was a sickness, a sweet poison she allowed herself to sip. It would begin as a flutter, a ghost of a symptom she would nurture in the secret, desperate gardens of her mind. And each month, the arrival of her blood was a quiet death, a confirmation of the barren dust bowl she carried within. The dignity she wore like armor grew heavier with every passing season, the polished facade of the serene queen hiding a woman hollowed out by her own inadequacy. She was a beautiful, useless thing, a doll for a king who required a mother. She pressed her forehead against the cool, unyielding glass, looking down at the kingdom below. The city of Nocturne was a lacework of silver light and deep shadow, its streets silent, its people moving with a preternatural grace she could never truly share. They were his. Immortal. Unchanging. She was the only truly dying thing in this entire land, her life a flickering candle flame in a timeless, windless hall. The thought was not morbid, it was simply a fact, as solid and cold as the stone beneath her feet. A shift in the air, subtle as a change in barometric pressure, heralded his arrival. It was always like this. The ambient sounds of the castle, the whisper of drafts, the groan of old stone, seemed to hold their breath. The shadows deepened, coalescing. He did not need to make a sound. The world itself announced him. King Theron stood in the archway, a silhouette carved from midnight and stillness. He was an absence of light, yet he commanded the room entirely. When he moved forward, the starlight from the dome caught on the silver threads in his black tunic, glinting like a captured constellation. He moved with a liquid silence that was both terrifying and mesmerizing, the apex predator of a world she was only visiting. Her instinct, the small, frightened animal that lived beneath her skin, screamed at her to flee. It was a primal, useless urge she had learned to suppress. She straightened, smoothing the deep blue velvet of her skirts, reassembling her armor of queenly composure piece by piece. She did not turn to face him. Not yet. She would grant herself this small, final moment of reprieve, facing the indifferent stars instead of his knowing, ancient eyes. You prefer the company of dead stars to your husband, Ilara? His voice was a low velvet rumble, devoid of accusation. It was a simple observation, yet it slid under her skin like a razor. They are not dead, my king, she replied, her own voice a carefully constructed calm. Just very far away. Their light takes an eternity to reach us. He was behind her now. She did not need to see him to feel the displacement of air, the sudden drop in temperature that was his alone. The faint, clean scent of cold stone, winter night, and something uniquely his, something like ozone after a lightning strike, filled her senses. Her heart, that traitorous bird, hammered against her ribs as if seeking escape. Eternity, he mused, the word rolling from his tongue like a polished stone. He stood so close she could feel the stillness emanating from him, a stark contrast to the frantic, living pulse inside her. You mortals have such a quaint fascination with it. This was their usual dance. The chasm between them a constant, unspoken presence in every conversation. His immortality and her fleeting, fragile life. He had never been cruel about it, but the fact of it was a wall between them, higher and more impenetrable than the castle's ramparts. He was forever. She was a breath, a sigh, a brief warmth that would soon be extinguished. He placed a hand on the glass beside her head, his long, pale fingers stark against the star-dusted darkness. The gesture was not threatening, yet it caged her in. She could see his reflection now, superimposed over the distant nebula. The sharp, aristocratic planes of his face, the fall of raven-black hair, and the eyes that held the deep, starless void of a moonless night. They were fixed on her reflection, not the sky. "What troubles you, my queen?" he asked, his voice softening just enough to be perilous. It was the softness that undid her, the quiet inquiry that promised to see past the armor she clung to so desperately. Hope, that cruel and foolish thing, whispered that he might understand, that he might offer comfort. She had spent 5 years crushing that hope under the heel of her duty, but tonight, under the weight of 1,000 silent stars, she was too weary to fight it. The words built in her throat, a bitter, choking tide. All the years of silent shame, of whispered prayers to forgotten gods, of scrutinizing her own body as if it were a foreign and hostile country. She turned from the glass, her carefully constructed composure finally shattering. The movement was sharp, brittle. She faced him, the full and terrible power of his presence washing over her. She had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze, to look into the endless night of his eyes. Tears she had refused to shed for half a decade burned behind her lids. "I have failed you," she began, the words tearing from her, ragged and raw. "The treaty, the air, it is my fault. The fault is mine." A flicker of something surprise? Curiosity moved in the depths of his eyes. He said nothing, his silence an invitation for her to complete her own execution. He simply watched her, his head tilted slightly, an ancient being observing a strange and fleeting phenomenon. The final, terrible truth felt like swallowing shards of glass. She took a shuddering breath, the sound loud in the immense quiet of the tower. Her gaze dropped to the intricate pattern of the marble floor, unable to bear the intensity of his. The armor was gone, leaving only the soft, vulnerable woman beneath. She whispered, "I can't bear a child." The confession hung in the air between them, small and devastating. It was the secret she had guarded more closely than her own life, the truth that defined her as a failure in her world and his. She waited for the verdict. For the cold dismissal, the rage, the quiet, disappointed sigh that would be worse than any anger. She braced for the pronouncement of her exile, for the end of her gilded, lonely charade. Silence stretched, pulled taut and thin. It lasted a lifetime. It lasted 10. When she finally dared to lift her eyes, he was not angry. He was not disappointed. The vampire king grinned. It was not a smile of warmth or humor. It was a sharp, brilliant, and terrifying expression that showed the barest hint of his canines. It was a grin that held the wisdom of ages, the patience of a predator, and a startling, unnerving flicker of triumph. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind, already reeling, went utterly blank. This was not a reaction she had ever, in her most fevered nightmares, anticipated. Then he said, his voice a low, hypnotic purr that vibrated through the very stone beneath her feet, "I'll give you my immortality." The words did not compute. They were sounds without meaning, a sentence from a language she did not speak. Immortality? She stared at him, her confusion a raw, open wound. What did that mean? How was that an answer? An heir was the answer. A child of their commingled blood was the solution to the political stability of two nations. Immortality was nothing. It was an abstract concept, a poet's fancy, a curse he bore alone. His grin softened into something less predatory, something that bordered on genuine amusement at her shock. "You think in such small, mortal terms, Alara. A child. A single, fragile life to secure a legacy. A legacy that will crumble to dust in 1,000 years anyway." He took a step closer, and this time she did not flinch away. She was frozen, trapped in the strange gravity of his proposal. He reached out, his cool fingers gently brushing a tear from her cheek. The touch was like a spark of ice, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a terrifying, nascent thrill. I am not looking for a son to inherit my throne in a century, he continued, his thumb stroking her skin, his eyes holding hers captive. I am looking for a queen to rule beside me for 10,000 years. An heir is a temporary solution. You could be a permanent 1 inch. Her heart, which had been hammering with terror, gave a single, painful lurch of something she could only identify as hope. But this was a different hope than the maternal longing she had nurtured and killed month after month. This was a wild, terrible, and exhilarating thing. The wolf inside her, the part that had been caged and tamed by duty, lifted its head and listened. I don't understand, she stammered, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. A child born of you would be half mortal. Powerful, yes, but vulnerable. A target. Something that could be taken from us. Something that would one day die, or rise to challenge me. He withdrew his hand, and she felt the loss of its cold anchor immediately. He began to pace slowly around her, a panther circling its precious, mystifying prey. They sent you to me as a broodmare, a pretty vessel to carry on a name. They underestimated you. And, he added, his voice dropping, they underestimated me. He stopped in front of her again. I do not want an heir, Alara. I want an equal. I have walked this world for millennia. I have seen empires rise from the sand and be swallowed by it again. I have seen stars born and die. The one thing I have never had is a constant. A partner who will not wither and fade like a winter rose. The scope of his words was too vast, a concept her mind could not grasp. Eternity. Not as a poem, but as a reality. To watch everyone she had ever known grow old and die. To see the mountains erode and the coastlines change. To leave the sun behind forever and embrace the endless, silvered night. It was not a gift. It was a sentence. A cage far larger and more permanent than this castle. You would make me, like you? The question was a whisper of awe and horror. More, he said, the single word resonating with power. You would be the first of your kind. A queen made, not born. Not a creature of instinct and bloodlust, but one of choice and will. My will, he paused, and yours. The choice. He was offering her a choice. For 5 years, she'd had none. Her path had been determined from the moment of her birth. Daughter, princess, political pawn, wife, and, it was assumed, mother. Every step had been laid out for her on a map drawn by others. Now he was offering her a blank page, a terrifying, infinite expanse. Why? She asked, the single, crucial question that pulsed beneath all the others. Why me? He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the ancient power and the predator's calm. She saw a flicker of something achingly familiar. Loneliness. A profound, deep-seated solitude that dwarfed her own. Because for 5 years, you have lived in my world of shadows, and you have not broken, he said softly. You have worn your dignity like a shield and your grace like a crown, even when your heart was breaking. I have seen you tend the moon-petal gardens that wither under any other mortal touch. I have heard you read the ancient texts in languages no human has spoken for centuries. You are not a vessel, Alara. You are a fire banked to embers. I merely wish to give you the fuel to burn for as long as I do. His honesty was more disarming than any threat. He saw her. Not as a failed womb, not as a political treaty, but as her. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. In his ancient, inhuman eyes, she was not lacking. She was potential. She thought of her home, of the warm sun on her face, the scent of rain on summer grass, the sound of her sister's laughter. All of it would be lost, turned to memory, then to dust. She would become a ghost in her own history, a story told about a princess who disappeared into the night. It was a monstrous price to pay. But what was the alternative? To live out her short, barren life here as a pretty failure? To be eventually and kindly set aside when it became clear no heir would ever come? To wither in this cold, beautiful castle, a relic of a failed treaty, until age and sorrow stole her last breath? That, too, was a kind of prison. A death sentence delivered slowly, courteously, over decades. Theron offered a different prison. One of endless night, endless time, but one where she would not be alone. And one where she would have power. He held out his hand. It was not a command, but an invitation. His palm was pale, traced with faint blue veins, a map of his unending life. "You do not need to give me your answer now," he said. "The offer is not a fleeting thing. It will be waiting for you, for as long as your mortal heart continues to beat." She looked from his hand to his face. The grin was gone, replaced by an unnerving stillness, a patient waiting that was perhaps the most intimidating thing about him. He would wait. He had all the time in the world. The choice was hers. A short life of fading sunlight and certain irrelevance, or an eternity of shared darkness and unimaginable power. A warm grave or a cold throne. Ilara did not take his hand. But she did not back away. She stood before him, the tears on her face having dried in the cold tower air, the broken pieces of her queenly armor at her feet. For the first time in 5 years, she felt not the crushing weight of her failure, but the dizzying, terrifying lightness of a future she might actually get to choose. The bird in her chest was no longer frantic. It was still, listening, waiting. The silence in the observatory returned, but it was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with the deafening roar of 1,000 unspoken possibilities, each one stretching into an endless, star-dusted night. And in the center of it all stood the king, a promise of forever, waiting for her to say yes. He left her there, a silent wraith melting back into the shadows from which he came, leaving behind only the chill of his presence and the scent of ozone. The choice settled over her, a cloak woven from starlight and shadow, heavier than any crown she had ever worn.